A quick ask before we start the episode. We have a survey, a very brief survey that we would love for you to fill out. There's a link right there in the show notes. It'll help us learn a bit more about you and what keeps you downloading the shows so we can create the best possible stories that connect to your interests. And as a thank you for completing the survey, if you leave your email at the end, you will have a chance to win a $100 Amazon gift card. Thank you so much for listening and for filling out the survey.
From the studios of Postscript Media and Canary Media.
I'm Shail Khan, and this is Catalyst.
All right, Europe's current plan is to cut natural gas use by about 2/3 before this winter. Can they actually go 100%? Can they cut, if they needed to, or if they needed to make a credible threat on the global stage to Putin that we will cut our gas use entirely if you don't get to the negotiating table? We think that they can do that.
Purely in the context of energy and climate, the conflict in Ukraine is either a really big deal or the biggest deal. Those are the possibilities.
Let's face it, environmental news is often very depressing. That's why we focus on solutions on this podcast. But still, the climate crisis looms large. Rising temperatures, mounting pollution, environmental degradation, they're all warping the planet. And for a lot of species, including us, things don't always look so great. But the story doesn't end there. Every Friday, Living Planet, a show from Deutsche Welle, takes you behind the headlines to figure out what's happening and how we'll get through it. It'll also help you make better choices for a healthy planet and find space to reconnect with the beauty and wonder of the world around us. You can find Living Planet wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Shail Khan. I'm a partner at the venture capital firm Energy Impact Partners. Welcome. So the expression, "you can't see the forest for the trees," has always bugged me, mainly because I've never been able to make sense of the syntax of that phrase. Nevertheless, I've sort of been feeling that way about the current situation with natural gas and oil and global energy geopolitics as it relates to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The trees themselves, what's happening in real time in energy markets and all the downstream effects of those markets, are big and complicated and foreboding to really understand, but it is crazy. Last week, European natural gas prices spiked to basically the equivalent of about $600 per barrel if it were converted to oil. We've never seen anything like that. Not to mention that natural gas was already in a wild period before this conflict started. So separating Russia and Ukraine from the broader dynamics of that market adds a whole other layer. But I also have this growing suspicion that we're going to look back on this time right now, and this conflict as being a seminal turning point for global energy and decarbonization. That would be the forest. Or maybe to frame it differently, and please forgive in advance my absolute torturing of this metaphor, maybe all the efforts to transition away from fossil fuels, and especially gas, and doubly especially in Europe, over the past decade have been adding tinder, but this Ukraine conflict will spark the fire, the forest fire, so to speak. I don't know, but I've been wanting to unpack what's actually happening here and how Europe can and might insulate itself from Russian hydrocarbons, and ultimately what it might mean for the longer term in this transition. Thankfully, my much smarter friend, Jesse Jenkins, also wanted to unpack the same thing, and he's much better equipped to do so than me. Jesse is many things, but in his day job, he's a professor at the Andlinger Center at Princeton University. I've never had a bad conversation with Jesse in the decade plus that we've known each other, and fortunately after this one, the streak continues. So, with no further ado, Jesse Jenkins. Jesse, welcome to Catalyst.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
It is great to have you here. There is so much to talk about with regard to the impact of this Ukraine invasion on energy, both in the near term and in the long term. And I'm confused as hell about all of it. So I'm hoping that you can help elucidate what's really happening a bit. I think we want to take this in three parts. First, I want to talk about what was the state of affairs with regard to Russia's role, and I guess Ukraine's role to a lesser extent, in global energy markets prior to this invasion. Then let's talk about what is happening right now, because obviously it is an extremely dynamic moment in global energy markets today, and you're seeing stuff change in real time. And then I think we want to spend some time on the kind of potential mid and long-term effects that this might have. How might this reshape the global energy ecosystem? How might it change the pace of decarbonization, that kind of thing? So let's start with, rewind a couple of months. what was Russia's role in global energy markets? How important was it, and to whom?
So Russia is a hugely important part of the global energy market. They're one of the top exporters of oil and natural gas in the world, and particularly for Europe, which is more dependent on Russia than any other source for their imports of energy. European Union's 27 members get about a quarter of their oil from Russia, and about 40% of all natural gas consumed in the EU is imported from Russia as well. Most of that via pipelines that come, westward from Russia and other former Soviet republics, including via transit through Ukraine, which is host to some major pipelines that are built to move gas from Russia through to Europe. They also supply a substantial amount of coal, about 40 million metric tons of coal to Europe each year as well. So it's not just oil and gas; they're also a coal exporter. And so, Europe has been heavily integrated with Russia for its energy needs, and was actually, strengthening those ties before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, with the completion and planned startup of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is an undersea pipeline that was going to bring additional gas from Russia into Germany that was scheduled to go online this year, until the invasion changed pretty much everything.
So that's interesting. So prior to the Ukraine invasion, the trend line in terms of Europe's reliance on Russian gas in particular was up, not down?
Yeah, that's right. And, I think this reflects a theory of kind of global politics in the post-Soviet, post-Cold War era, which is that, greater integration of economies via trade would help reduce the risk of conflict, would make, countries so codependent on one another that they would not risk open conflict or other types of, geopolitical struggles that would threaten those economic ties. This was really the underlying thesis for the European Union at the beginning after World War II, which began as the European Coal and Steel Union, right, to sort of manage integrated production of coal and steel so that every country, France and Germany in particular, were so dependent on each other for their raw materials that they couldn't conceive of a third world war between them. Similar theory around engagement with China and the United States and our, sort of codependence for manufactured goods and their exports for their economy. So, Germany in particular and others in Europe thought that, many leaders in Germany thought that strengthening, that tie between Europe and Russia would mean that Russia was so dependent on Europe for trade and for their revenue, and Europe so dependent on Russia for their energy needs that would actually strengthen peace and prosperity between the trading partners.
Which turns out to be a somewhat suspect assumption given current events. I want to talk for a second about the difference between Europe and North America in this regard, because we're sitting here in the US, obviously, and I think we'll probably spend most of our time talking about Europe in this conversation because, as you said, Europe is heavily reliant on Russia for oil and gas and coal. Less true in the US, right?
That's right. On a whole, the United States has actually become energy self-sufficient in net, at least. We are net exporters of petroleum products, liquids, and we are net exporters of natural gas, and we're certainly net exporters of coal. That wasn't the case when Barack Obama took office in 2008. We imported about 60% of our oil in 2008, and we're poised to open up a number of liquefied natural gas import terminals across the country to import natural gas from Qatar and from Australia and other places with an abundance. The shale gas revolution and later the shale oil revolution really changed all of that in the United States in the North American context, so that moving forward from 2008 to now, we've seen steady increases in production of oil and gas in North America, and now we have reached that sort of fabled point of energy independence, at least from a strict physical standpoint, which makes the United States in a very different place than Europe when it comes to physical energy security. If we were in the position that Europe was and we had to cut our ties to Russia, we could do it. In fact, the Congress just voted to say we're going to ban imports of Russian oil, and that doesn't really disrupt our physical, trade very much because we only imported a small amount of our crude oil from Russia, and on net, again, are exporting more than we consume here. And so it shows that physical security does matter. I mean, the fact that it will take significant amount of time for Europe to phase down its reliance on Russian imports, has geopolitical consequences for what the degree of freedom that Europe has to negotiate this crisis. But I think if you look around, and all of us are seeing the price at the pump here in the United States, we can see that there's another type of energy security and economic security that we are still very vulnerable to, in the sense that oil is a global commodity. And so that even though we don't directly consume much oil from Russia, the fact that Russia constitutes a substantial amount of the global oil trade means that potential embargoes and self-sanctioning of private companies on that are now reluctant to pick up Russian crude cargoes and transport them to market means that already just that small reduction in exports from Russia has caused ripples across the entire oil market, and means that the actions of a mad dictator in in one part of halfway around the world impact the cost at the pump in Des Moines, Iowa, or Denver, Colorado, all the way around the world. And now we're seeing $4, $5, $6 a gallon gasoline prices in the U.S. Again, even though we're not directly consuming Russian oil, and we are technically, physically self-sufficient in terms of our oil, and that's because oil is a global commodity. It's traded fungibly across the world, and so it doesn't really matter as much where you directly consume it from. The price goes up for everybody at the same time.
So as of a few months ago, global state of affairs, Russia, super important player in global energy geopolitics. U.S. not reliant really actually on Russian imports, but impacted by the global market for oil in particular, less so for natural gas. And meanwhile, Europe actually pretty reliant on Russia and strengthening ties, building out the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and so on. Okay, so let's fast forward to the invasion. So invasion happens, Russia invades Ukraine. There's a lot to unpack as far as what the impacts are sort of today, but let's start with the natural gas market dynamic, because that feels like that's the most immediate and obvious substantive craziness that's been going on. So what did this do to the natural gas market in Europe and in Russia?
Even before the physical invasion, in the run up to the invasion, when Russia was positioning troops and threats of future sanctions were being issued by the West, it was already sort of tight gas market conditions in Europe, and in fact, many observers, geopolitical observers, believe that factored into the timing of Russia's decision to invade this year and not last year or some future year. In fact, during the invasion of Crimea in 2014, that was another period of very tight oil and gas markets. So the thinking goes that Putin knew that this was the point of maximum leverage that Russia had over Europe and others. That the threat of withholding their supplies from the global stage would be most severe. And so time the invasion for that period. And there's some incidental evidence to support that, in that Gazprom, the Russian gas company, owns a lot of storage assets for natural gas in Europe. And if you look at the storage volumes for Gazprom-owned storage assets in Europe, they were much lower than the average for other assets at the time. So it's almost as if the nationally owned Russian gas company was deliberately keeping the tanks partially full going into this winter to further exacerbate the risk of shortfall. So all that is said, even before the boots on the ground, crossed the border into Ukraine and started laying waste to the country, the natural gas prices were very high already in Europe, and that partly reflects that on the margin, the available import capacity is all liquefied natural gas, not the pipelines, which are already running at full capacity. And so LNG, like oil, has become a globally traded commodity. And so if Europe needs more gas, they have to outbid Korea and Japan and everyone else. And so prices start to go through the roof. And I think I don't have these stats right in front of me right now, but I think where the United States was paying $4 a million British thermal units or MMBTU for gas here in the U.S. At the same time, customers in Germany or Poland were paying like $26 per MMBTU for gas. So almost like 5-6 fold higher prices or almost an order of magnitude. And that's only gotten worse since the invasion actually started, and now now Europe is trying to plot a course away from Russian gas to reduce their reliance as quickly as possible.
Yeah, we'll come back to the plot to wean Europe off of Russian gas. I want to spend a fair amount of time on that because I think that's maybe the most important kind of medium and long-term impact of this from an energy perspective. I also want to just make a quick callback because last week on this show, I had Nat Bullard on from Bloomberg. We were talking about carbon markets, and one of the things that happened in the compliance carbon markets in Europe was that prices shot up, right? We were seeing €100 per ton CO2 prices. And the reason for that was these rising natural gas prices that you were just describing. So there have been all these knock-on effects. I mean, that's CO2 prices, but another one that I've been spending a bunch of time on is fertilizer, right? Which has become globally because natural gas fertilizer is generally, ammonia is produced using natural gas. Hydrogen is generally produced using natural gas. Ammonia is produced using hydrogen. Natural gas prices go up. Price of fertilizer goes up. Plus, we've got all these other supply chain kerfuffles going on all over the world. And we're in like a really serious challenge globally in terms of fertilizer prices, and places that can't, farmers are hurting. Places that can't afford to pay more for fertilizer are not planting as many crops. Like we're in there may be a bit of a food shortage globally. And it all mostly draws back to these natural gas markets. And so I think it's important. This is also true, by the way, of a bunch of other industries that have shut down production in Europe and things like that. So it's important to note that I'm always reminded of energy is not a market in itself that's that important. It's because energy powers everything. And so when you have these kinds of disruptions in things like natural gas that we become very reliant on, the downstream effects of that are just monumental.
Yeah, I mean, it shows the complexity and in some cases fragility of our globally connected economy, right? I mean, the fact that globalization has gone, to such a degree that all these markets are integrated in one way or another across the world, and so small disruptions or even large disruptions like this can have big ripple effects all down the chain. And we talk, food. We talk about the energy, challenge. The other big implication of the invasion is for global food markets. Ukraine is in many ways the breadbasket of Eastern Europe and also parts of Russia that produce a lot of wheat. Ukraine is a major exporter of wheat and corn. So is Russia. Much of that goes to relatively low income countries in North Africa and the Middle East who can't produce, they're not food self-sufficient, right? They cannot grow enough food for themselves. And so now they're looking at, soaring wheat and corn prices as well. And potentials for famine and food shortages, across good chunks of the world. That's even without factoring in the effect that you mentioned of higher gas prices making the supply of ammonia, limited and also much more expensive for farmers as well. So, huge implications of the conflict all over the world. Really, just pretty dire impacts, felt by people everywhere, due to these sorts of global supply chains in food and energy and other important commodities.
Right. Okay. So then Russia does invade Ukraine and does put boots on the ground. And as you said, lays waste to parts of the country. And then there have been a bunch of sort of immediate fallout impacts. Cancellation of Nord Stream 2, import embargoes. You mentioned, the U.S. saying we're no longer going to import Russian oil and gas. Unpack sort of what have been all the immediate ramifications, and have they all just generally served to exacerbate the existing trend line, which is short supply of oil and gas, and so prices spiking, or is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, so it's interesting, to look at the response of, the Western powers, right? That basically said we're going to do everything we can short of, actually engaging NATO troops in combat. But so far, they actually haven't been willing to do everything, right? They have exempted energy trade very deliberately from the economic sanctions that were imposed pretty rapidly after the initial invasion. I think Putin miscalculated a lot of things here, right? Obviously miscalculated the ferocity and bravery of the Ukrainian troops. Miscalculated how efficient and effective his army was, and how quickly they would take Ukraine. They also miscalculated how effective Western financial sanctions would be on the Russian currency and the value of the ruble and the strength of their economy. So the fact that the U.S. and other central banks were willing to seize the Russian central bank's foreign currency reserves overseas and basically say you can no longer transact in euros and dollars was not something that Putin anticipated. And in fact, they tried to build up this sort of fortress Russia in anticipation of further sanctions by building a huge foreign currency reserve they could use to prop up their markets. And I promise this all comes back to energy, which is why I'm talking about foreign currency, because now with those economic sanctions in place, the only way that Russia can get dollars and euros to exchange for rubles and keep the ruble from collapsing entirely is by garnishing the wages, effectively the trade and income of Russian companies doing business overseas. So the central bank doesn't have access to its foreign currency anymore. But what it's doing is requiring that I think 80% of all trade in dollars and euros by Russian companies is converted back into rubles when they bring the money back to Russia. And so, well, what is the foreign trade that's left when sanctions are imposed on aircraft and wheat and all kinds of other commodities? Well, it's energy and it's energy products. It's gas and oil and coal make up the majority already of Russia's exports, and now make up almost the entirety of their foreign currency exchange, which is sort of the last thing keeping their economy from collapsing. And so, there was this sort of deliberate effort of the Western powers to basically say, look, we're not going to sanction energy right away because we know Europe is dependent on oil and gas from Russia, and we want to make sure that companies know they should continue to buy that, that crude and buy that gas and bring it in for now. But the companies, actually, the private sector, moved faster, I think, than the governments have, in the sense that Western oil and gas companies, Western shipping companies that would have bought cargo shipments of crude oil and shipped them out of Russia, have been very reluctant to engage in business with Russia for reputational reasons and also for risk of they're concerned risk that there will be future sanctions coming. And so they've self-sanctioned effectively and said, look, we're not going to buy this stuff from you anymore. And already we're starting to see, I think the estimates are about 1.5 million barrels of oil a day, which is, I think, on the order of 1 or 2% of the global market of what normally would have been Russian crude being exported, not finding a buyer. There's no one willing to pick it up and take it to Europe or take it to Japan or take it elsewhere. And so they are already, even though the pipelines are still flowing, the seaborne trade is already starting to get locked in, and they're having to sell their oil at a discount to get someone else from China or other countries to buy it. And so we're already starting to see these sort of effects just from the private sector not wanting to do business with Russia. And again, just a small reduction in global supply can have a big impact on global prices because the market is so tight. So that 1 or 2% reduction in crude supply has contributed to that, and the sort of perceived future risk that's being priced in of even greater scarcity has doubled oil prices, right, to over $100 a barrel now. So again, it's when you have tight markets like this with not a lot of slack, not a lot of producers that can step in and increase output to replace Russia's output in the short term, that can lead to very rapid price escalations when even only a few percent reduction in supply occurs.
All right. So because this podcast is primarily focused on technologies for decarbonization, I want to bring it back to that. So the upshot of much of what you're discussing so far, I think, is two things. You could tell me if you feel like either of those are wrong or there are more big things. But the upshot is, one, kind of record high prices for fossil fuels, for oil and for natural gas, particularly in Europe. High prices for oil globally, higher prices for natural gas everywhere. But, sort of record-setting insane prices in Europe. And then second, kind of an exposure of the geopolitical risk and volatility in these markets that, it's not like it wasn't known, but it's really come to the fore. And in the immediate term, it feels to me like that there's a bunch of calculus that changes around alternatives, right? We certainly see a million things that are saying we're going to replace natural gas used for process X or in market X with this other thing. And maybe on day one, historically, that's not been economic because natural gas, especially in the US, is generally extraordinarily cheap. First of all, those numbers are starting to flip because natural gas prices are high. And then second, there's also this sort of like risk and volatility thing. So there's this like very immediate, like, oh, a bunch of things that didn't make economic sense kind of do make sense, but they might only make sense right now because we're in this supply crunch and in this global geopolitical disaster. But then there's also this sort of the fact that this has exposed this risk, particularly on Europe. There's a broadly recognized need to reduce Europe's reliance on Russian imports as fast as humanly possible. So can you talk a little bit about what the plan is, the stated plan, which exists now by the European Union to reduce its reliance on Russian imports, and then we could talk about what that might actually mean in terms of new technology adoption.
Yeah, and let's maybe talk also about some of the different motivations here, right? So there's a near term and kind of immediate motivation, which is, that there's a geopolitical motivation, right? Which is that Russia, as I mentioned before, is now dependent on its oil and gas exports to prop up its economy, to generate revenue that's going straight into the war effort, right? It's, German purchases of natural gas and oil leading to, dollars to the Kremlin that are, quite literally being used to pay for bombs that are killing civilians in Ukraine. So there's a moral imperative, right, to cut European consumption as rapidly as possible. And then I think there's this economic imperative that, look, like, maybe it's Russia today, but maybe it's Iran tomorrow, or it's China and flexing its muscle, causing some disruption later that, just exacerbates the level of economic insecurity that our economies inherently have if we're dependent on these globally traded commodities, oil and increasingly LNG for Europe. And so there's now this sort of longer term economic motivation as well to literally free Europe from that kind of volatility. So again, there's sort of an immediate, I think, geopolitical strategy, which actually could relate to, putting pressure on Russia to get to the negotiating table and reach a peace settlement faster, right, by threatening to further destabilize their economy by reducing, by cutting off imports to Europe. There's a moral imperative because the money being spent on Russian fossil fuels is going straight to the war effort and killing Ukrainians. And there's a long-term economic security rationale, which is also true, by the way, for the United States, right? That even though, again, we are net exporters in oil and gas, we are not economically secure because we remain reliant on these globally traded fossil fuels. And so, I think that the challenge, is to, in the near term, the moral and security imperative are immediate. We need to do everything we can today to try to end the conflict and to stop the killing. And so that argues for doing whatever you can do quickly. And then in the longer term, there's this economic security argument that might motivate longer term, more transformational changes that you can achieve over a 5 or 10 year period. So in the short term, you don't have as many degrees of freedom. And one of the things you can do is fossil fuel substitution. So, this is why you said EU ETS, carbon permit prices were skyrocketing because with high gas prices, now all of a sudden it makes sense for Europe to turn back to coal in the power sector.
For which they are not as reliant. I mean, they import some from Russia, but not nearly as much, right? Because we've got coal in Poland and other places.
Exactly. They're not as reliant on the imports. They could easily, the United States could easily step up our exports to Europe to eliminate Russian coal now, and we should do that, right? From a moral and strategic imperative perspective, we should be exporting more coal to Europe now, and they should stop buying all coal from Russia. That's the easiest one of the three fuels for us to displace. But because the economics has changed, it now makes sense to use coal instead of gas and power generation, and so that's driven up emissions and therefore permit prices in the auctions. So using more coal instead of gas is one way to do that. Using alternative supplies of liquefied natural gas, including from the United States, who's now going to do what we can to ramp up our LNG exports. President Biden and the EU Commission, reached an agreement last week to increase our exports by at least 15 billion cubic meters this year and up to 50 billion cubic meters over the longer term. 50 is enough to displace about a third of Russia's imports just with U.S. LNG over the medium term. And that 15 BCM is about a tenth of the Russian imports right now. So we can knock out 10% of Russia's gas imports with U.S. LNG right now, today. And then, there are going to be other pipelines they can use. So all of that is much more fossil dependent. Like, let's find other sources of fossil fuels that we can use very quickly to get off of Russian gas. And then there are some more dramatic and costly conservation efforts that can be done quickly, you're already seeing, as you mentioned, industry respond to high prices by producing less commodities that use natural gas. So there's already some price destruction, price demand destruction going on. But there can be other conservation measures, right? The Europeans could, in solidarity with Ukraine, turn the thermostat down in the winter, a couple degrees, and that could save, 8% of their natural gas consumption for heating. So there are measures like that you can do in the short run. And we've been looking at this in my group at Zero Lab with, some great rapid assistance from students and postdocs at Princeton to sort of see, all right, Europe's current plan is to cut natural gas use by about 2/3 before this winter. Can they actually go 100%? Can they cut if they needed to, or if they needed to make a credible threat on the global stage to Putin that we will cut our gas use entirely if you don't get to the negotiating table? We think that they can do that. We think that there is a viable strategy that with the right, wartime mentality, it would be possible to do what people probably thought was impossible just a month ago, and that's get off of Russian gas entirely by this October, this winter. It take a lot of effort, but wars often have a way of making what seemed impossible possible, and the possible necessary. So I think that's what's going to probably happen here, even though Europe has so far only outlined plans to get 2/3 reduction this year of natural gas imports. I think it may be possible to go all the way to it would completely eliminate Russian gas, which again is 40% of their total gas use. So that's a huge overnight shift.
It's really amazing, for all the wrong reasons. We never wish this upon the world. But in some ways, it reflects, like, you think of these things as changing so slowly over such a long time. Like, if you had said to me a year ago, Europe wants to get off of Russian gas, how long is that going to take? Even with coordination amongst the EU, I would have said decade plus, right? But turns out they actually can do it within a year, you're saying. It's sort of amazing. Albeit, as you said, it takes a wartime mentality, and it's not without pain, right? I don't know if have you analyzed the potential impact on prices that they would pay? Is it cost neutral?
Yeah, that's our next step, is sort of the cost implications. They're significant, right? There are significant costs incurred, which is why they've been so reluctant to want to do that. But, I think the longer the war drags on, the more war crimes that are committed by the Russian military, the more civilian deaths that we see, the clearer the moral imperative is that just like it doesn't really matter what it costs, we just have to do it. And the U.S. should do everything it can to help Europe, immediately get off of Russian imports. And again, in the short term, that does include increasing fossil fuel exports to Europe. Even includes increasing coal consumption, which is going to have short-term negative implications for climate mitigation and for air pollution. But again, those are going to be short-term measures. They should be short-term measures. And in the medium term, we have more degrees of freedom. So if in the near term there are very costly measures we have to take from either a climate or air pollution perspective, or from an economic perspective, like conservation, or just simply having reduced output in industry, which has could lead to a recession in Europe. Right. These sorts of short-term impacts are big, but in the longer term, we can ramp up new energy supplies and start to ease off of those more costly measures. And so that, by 2025 or 2026, in the sort of 3 to 4 year time frame, it should be possible to get back to sort of typical European, conditions, albeit with dramatically lower oil and gas consumption, particularly gas consumption. And that's going to be achieved by accelerating the kind of clean energy transition that Europe was already on as rapidly as they can. So that includes deploying wind and solar, ramping up biomethane production, trying to birth a new hydrogen industry, which again won't amount to much in the 2025 timeframe, but can be a long-term strategic alternative to natural gas. And improvements in energy efficiency, switching to heat pumps in buildings, all those sorts of measures that are also exactly what we need to do to confront climate change, now have a added motivation and a very clear imperative, at least for Europe. And the question is whether we're going to see that same kind of realization here in the United States, that, hey, even though we are big oil exporters, it would be a lot better and a lot more impactful, honestly, in the near term from a geopolitical standpoint, for us to focus on reducing domestic use of oil and gas, which strengthens our economic energy security and frees up our domestic production for export to our allies in Europe and Japan and elsewhere, which strengthens our geopolitical hand. So rather than just drill, baby, drill and continue to, consume as we have, we get double the bang for the buck if we're producing, steadily increasing U.S. fossil fuel production while reducing, accelerating the clean energy and efficiency transition and reducing domestic use so that we're working on both the supply and the demand side at the same time. That could free up very large amounts of oil and gas for export over the medium and sort of 5 to 10 year time frame that could make the U.S. the leading exporter in the world of both oil and gas, and give us a much stronger geopolitical position, even as we again strengthen our efforts to reduce emissions and strengthen our economic energy security at home. So I very much hope that's what the U.S. does, but I have not seen the same kind of clarity of leadership and mind on that as we have in Europe yet.
But you have seen that in Europe, you're saying. I mean, is your sense that all the things you just mentioned, accelerating the clean energy transition, Europe was already more aggressive, I would say, on that transition than the U.S. was? Are you saying it's accelerating even faster? And what have we seen, again, setting aside the kind of very near-term measures that the European Union is taking? What's the 3 to 5 year plan?
Yeah, so the plan, we basically seen acceleration of measures that were already in place. So looking at how quickly they can deploy wind and solar, there's been discussions about changing permitting for onshore wind and other things that could help accelerate deployment. Some countries, Belgium so far, has decided to prolong the retirement schedule for their existing nuclear power plants so that they don't have to turn to gas to fill the gap in the near term. So Belgium had several reactors that was scheduled to close this year. They're going to push that back by a decade. So far, Germany, who has 3 reactors that they are about to close this year, has not decided to do that, although it came up as a topic of national conversation, at least, which was remarkable in and of itself that they were willing to broach the conversation after having such a strong, long-term consensus about the need for the nuclear phase out there. So far, that's not a measure that they have decided to take, but it could still change their mind before the end of the year if the alternatives to doing that start to become clear, like we're going to burn a lot more coal or we're going to see a lot more industrial, conservation and demand reduction. The other measures are not easy either. So we are seeing, a rethinking of the role of nuclear. Poland and other countries are now saying they want to drive, and France are saying they want to drive more new nuclear deployment faster than originally planned. Basically it I think throws out the natural gas as a bridge fuel strategy in Europe that was previously the plan, and causes a rethink of all of that, right? Where now, we don't want to really rely on natural gas as a bridge fuel because it is primarily going to come from Europe, or it's going to be U.S. natural gas, LNG exports, which are expensive. Even if they're from a friendly country, they're still very expensive. And so, I don't think in the long term, Europe wants to trade their dependence on Russian gas for U.S. LNG. They may be willing to do that in the near term, or as a piece of the overall puzzle, but they are going to want to dramatically reduce their reliance on gas overall, and that means accelerating the transition towards wind and solar, rethinking the role of nuclear, and accelerating the deployment of heat pumps and energy efficiency in buildings and industry so that they can reduce consumption on the demand side.
You've probably seen this. There's been this insurgent move that people are talking about heat pumps for freedom, U.S. exporting heat pumps to Europe for deployment there. Is that a realistic idea? Would that be impactful?
My sense is that probably has the situation backwards, that Europe and Asian, manufacturers produce more of the global heat pump market, with some kind of bold wartime effort to remake our manufacturing base over a few years. Sure, you could do something like that. We could probably direct all U.S. manufacturing of air conditioning units to switch over to heat pumps. But there is some, what I've seen is there's some concern that U.S. air-to-air heat pumps, which is what we primarily use here, where we're using, like an air conditioner, you're moving heat from the air outside into the inside for forced air ducts. In Europe, they use a lot of water, forced water heating, and we don't have a lot of hydronic heat pumps that do water, air to water type heating. It's just not what we build and use in the U.S. very often. And so most of the stuff we deploy here comes from Europe in that, category. And so it's not clear that we can really step up our exports of heat pumps in a meaningful way. And even in the short term, if you look at the current EU strategy for this year, they're talking about doubling the amount of heat pump deployment next year, and that's enough to reduce the consumption of natural gas, I think, by about, if I'm not mistaken, 1.5 billion cubic meters. So again, that's 1% of current Russian imports and a tenth of what we're going to do with LNG exports. So, it's just a smaller piece of the puzzle. The longer term, of course, it needs to be a big piece of the puzzle. And, I think we are going to see, hopefully in both the US and Europe, investments in our industrial base to produce these efficient, heat pumps to heat and cool buildings and to get off of natural gas. One of the things, there's a lot of reasons to do heat pumps, right? They're more efficient than a boiler because they're not converting energy, they're moving it around, so you can get 300-500% efficiency from a heat pump. And of course, they have zero direct emissions. That's good for air quality. That's good for CO2. You can switch over to clean electricity. That's good for climate mitigation. But from an energy security point of view as well, there are a bunch of different ways to produce electricity. Right? We talked about coal substitution for gas could be a very quick way for Europe to reconfigure its power production in the short term, right? We could also switch in the longer term to renewables. There's only one way to heat a gas boiler, right? And that's burning gas. And so the flexibility and fuel substitution ability you have with electric heating and electric transportation, I might add, for EVs is another step to improve our energy security by allowing more substitutability and more options that you just don't get in an electric, in an internal combustion engine car that only burns gasoline or a boiler that only burns, natural gas. There's really not a lot of substitutability you can do there. Maybe a little bit of biomethane, but not wholesale substitution. So again, adopting the different frames, climate, efficiency, economic security, that economic energy security argument also, I think, motivates the need for electrification of our economy in a more profound way than it had before, I think.
So it sounds like what you're saying is from a decarbonization perspective exclusively, the likely outcome here is probably a short-term increase in emissions, largely because of fuel switching in Europe, but a long-term acceleration of decarbonization because all the countermeasures that Europe in particular, and hopefully the US and other countries are going to take to wean themselves off of this reliance on Russia are going to be, generally speaking, lower carbon or zero carbon alternatives. Is that your sense of it?
Yes, switching from natural gas to coal in power generation will lead to increased emissions from the power sector. But if the European Union is also dramatically reducing natural gas consumption overall through demand-side measures and conservation, it may be that nets out, that the reduction in total gas burn is enough that it compensates for the temporary increase in emissions from coal consumption. Again, my team at the Princeton Zero Lab is running some models on this right now. Just a shout out to the value of open source energy models. We were able to fire up the open source Pipes Europe model from TU Berlin and others in Europe that built out and published this open source power system model. So we were able to we're running this week, cases of, well, what do we do over the next 18 months in Europe from a power sector perspective? How much coal to gas switching do you need or gas to coal switching do you need? All that's really easy to do when you have open source models that are right there ready to fire up when you need them. So just, appreciate the effort that our colleagues in Europe have made to build these models and make them available, so that our team here can now pick them up and try to do some rapid analysis that, really matters. So it's still an open question. We're trying to answer that here as to whether or not it'll be a net increase in emissions in the short run. We have started to see some life cycle emissions analysis as well that notes that because the Russian gas sector and oil sector has very high upstream emissions, they do a lot of flaring, they have a lot of leaks in their gas system, that even US LNG, depending again on the leak rates here in the US and where the gas is coming from, there's quite a range of upstream leakage. But even relying on US LNG to displace Russian pipeline gas may lead to a small net decrease in emissions because the greenhouse gas intensity of Russian gas is so high that even LNG, which is worse normally than pipelines because you consume energy to liquefy the gas and regasify it, may actually be about a wash or even a slight reduction in emissions. And so that's, I think the near-term climate implications are less dire than some folks might think. And I agree that the long-term looks like an acceleration of our transition away from fossil fuels, especially in Europe, but I think also likely in the United States as well.
One of the issues you always face, particularly in the United States, when you're trying to electrify something that was otherwise using natural gas, is that our electricity prices are tied to natural gas prices. And so when you have a spike in natural gas prices, you tend to see a spike in electricity prices as well. Curious the degree to which that is also true in Europe and what impacts that might have, and whether you think this that one of the outcomes here will be breaking that link to a large degree.
So that's definitely true. In the United States and in Europe, gas generators are often on the margin, meaning they set the market price because they're the last generator that can move up or down. I think that has switched in recent months, maybe with, no, I guess it's probably still true that they're on the margin now, and coal is cheaper even with the EU ETS prices. So yeah, I think that's probably true in the short run. And it's definitely true in the United States. In many markets, gas generators set the price a majority of hours of the year. And so on average, as gas prices go up, electricity prices go up as well. And so, yeah, I think that does, that linkage does mean it's not so obvious from an economic perspective that you need to immediately electrify everything, because electricity prices are also high. However, it does, I think, make it very clear from a policy perspective that providing additional incentives for consumers and businesses to electrify things makes good policy sense. And so I think we're going to see a redoubling of incentives in Europe and, again, hopefully in the United States for consumers and businesses to adopt heat pumps and electric vehicles and other measures, by subsidizing their purchase, so that even if the fuel, price, spread is not so immediately advantageous, it is from a consumer perspective. It, again, also is worth mentioning that a heat pump is so much more efficient than a gas boiler that it generally is still advantageous, even if if electricity prices are higher than gas prices, right? Because you think about, let's just roughly, for ease of purpose, say that a gas generator is 50% efficient. So you would expect electricity prices to be double natural gas prices. But if a heat pump is 3 or 4 times more efficient, then the effective cost of heating your house is actually lower. So it still is often, the price spread is still advantageous. It's just not as strong as it would otherwise be. And I do think longer term, you're right. It could split that link if basically natural gas plays a very small role in Europe's energy mix in another 5 years. That'll help drive a wedge between the prices in the power sector and the gas sector.
All right. Maybe we'll check back in on this in a year and see how well Europe did. I mean, this will be interesting to see how well Europe did at reducing its reliance in the very near term, and how well on track they are to the longer term, complete link breakage, and whether the U.S. followed suit. I do think that's an interesting question as well, and sort of TBD in my mind as well. But in the meantime, Jesse, thank you so much.
Thanks, Shale. I hope that was helpful. A lot to unpack here for sure.
Jesse Jenkins is an assistant professor at the Endlinger Center at Princeton University and a leading macro-scale energy modeler. This show is a co-production of Postscript Media and Canary Media. You can find the show on Twitter at @CatalystPod. You can also find me, Postscript, and Canary there too. Tag us to send feedback on this episode or suggest future topics. And if you like the show, go over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your episodes and leave us a rating and review. Or share this episode with a friend. You can find links for this episode's topic and guest in the show notes on canarymedia.com. Postscript is supported by my friends at Prelude Ventures, a venture capital firm that partners with entrepreneurs to address climate change across a range of sectors, including advanced energy, food and ag, transportation and logistics, advanced materials and manufacturing, and advanced computing. Our producers are Daniel Waldorf and Stephen Lacey. Mixing by Greg Vilfrank and Sean Marquand. Theme song by Sean Marquand. I'm Shale Khan, and this is Catalyst.